Okay, so this research is actually ongoing. We're in the middle. We're in the beginning of year 3 of a 3-year project. So it's come hot off the press, but also findings in progress. So let's bear that in mind. So well-being, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's in august places like the United Nations and the OECD World Forum, and it's also, of course, down the chemist as one of the ways in which they're branding products for us to consume. Many different understandings of what well-being is about then, and many different people who are trying to engage our interest through using well-being. And in the development context, you've got 2 different levels of it. On the one hand, this very national, international level in terms of measuring progress or measuring internationally recognised ways of measuring development. But you've also got a lot of interest at the much more immediate individual or community level, saying, actually, what difference are our projects making to people? Can we tell if they're doing any good? And that's the level that I'm more interested in and better equipped to talk about than that national level. So while wellbeing seems to be new and there's lots of kind of buzz around it and excitement around it, I think what's important to recognise is in many ways there's a lot of continuity with what has gone before. So within the development context, you have had for many, many years a recognition that economics is not everything, that economic growth is not everything. It's not a new idea. In fact, probably from the history of development throughout, there has been a recognition that you need to go beyond economics if you want to understand what's happening. So there's that sort of broadening, and development always likes to broaden its mouth and gobble up as much as it can. But there's also a concern to move beyond a purely expert-defined set of measures of what's important to people and say, well, let's be more participatory, let's look from the bottom up, let's actually ask people themselves what's important to them. Again, this isn't something that Wellbeing discovered, it's something that goes back certainly to community organising and through participatory approaches from the 1970s onwards, if not before. But it's a bringing together of those 2 things. And then more recently, of course, there is a so-called science of happiness in positive psychology, urging us to look at the positives, not always just to emphasise the negatives, the mental ill health, but also to look at mental health, and to seek to measure happiness, to say, if it's important, then we must be able to measure it. And that has been quite an important influence in terms of the well-being agenda. I wouldn't be speaking to you as a sociologist today if I couldn't also look at the skeptics and the critical voices. And these particularly come from people who are concerned about the politics of well-being. So there are many people who simply disagree with talking about well-being at all. They think that it is a whitewash and a way of getting away from the more critical perspective that can be brought about, for example, through discussion of rights. What is well-being about? Is it just going soft? Is it really going to be something that enables us to move on, or is it a way in which we can have sort of touchy-feely, good feeling, but actually under that banner, perhaps people's rights and achievements, political achievements, are going to be eroded. So there are some people who are completely against well-being. There are others who are more engaged but still critical. So there's a question, is there anything new at all? Is it just doing what we were always doing anyway, but giving it a new set of clothes, a new discourse, or a set of new discourses that we can play around with, but in fact it's pretty much business as usual? More critical still is there a danger that with well-being we're shifting away from an emphasis on the state towards the market, but also through that towards individual responsibility? So moving away from saying the state has core responsibilities to provide for its citizens, to say actually we're all responsible for our own well-being. You don't feel good about your life, you're the person who's got to sort it. Don't look to the state. So you can see that potentially, although well-being is often represented as though it's a politically broad and enabling kind of philosophy, potentially it could be there used in a way that actually minimises state provision or cuts people's benefits on the grounds that they should be able to look after themselves. Or another kind of critique says the trouble with well-being and its emphasis on the subjective is that it takes away from saying you need to change the world to saying you need to change how you feel about the world. If you're not feeling good, you've got a problem. Change it. Have a bit of cognitive behavioural therapy. Sort yourself out. So a number of different kinds of approaches to say actually we need to be very careful about well-being. Not simply to say we can go all out for this, but to say let's engage critically and think where does this go and where politically does it lead us. And that's something what we're trying to do in our research is to pay some attention to those political concerns and see, well, in terms of doing research on the ground into well-being and poverty, what does it tell us about what are the drivers of well-being and how important are politics in terms of state provision and in terms of the old things that we sociologists love to talk about, things like class and gender. So in the seminar, what I'm going to try to do, and I'll try to do it quite quickly, is first of all just to let you know something about the research we're doing. And I've brought some information here which you're welcome to take away. So this is just a brief kind of flyer about the project. This is a bit more of a briefing about what we're doing. Both of those are downloadable from the website. And there's also a little flyer of a continuing professional development unit that we do in teaching the method of assessment of well-being that I'm going to describe here. I'm then going to present some of our findings, and as I said, we're in the middle of the project. So we have done one round of research in both locations, in Zambia and in India. At present, the team is working in Zambia, just about to come to the end. We started in August, coming to the end of October, and we'll be going back to India in February. So it's ongoing research, and I want to present findings from the first round to take us forward to the next round, and then to reflect on what those findings tell us about these bigger issues, about the politics of well-being. And a health warning before I go any further is to say I'm not talking about Zambia and India and well-being there. The sites where we're working are quite particular, and whereas I hope that we can generalise a bit about the people whom we have met in our research there, we certainly can't generalise from those sites to the national level. So if I slip into saying India and Zambia, bear with me. I actually mean these particular sites where we've been doing the research. So defining well-being, we already discussed that there isn't any ultimate definition of well-being, but there is a set of agreements really about the territory that we need to be talking about. And there are these three terms which you'll come up against, which are often used in quite interchangeable ways. Some people are very strong that no, this means that and that means that. But well-being, happiness, quality of life, they are on sort of overlapping territories, I would say. I've made sense of them as distinct here. Other people would have a different view on this. Happiness is clearly subjective, and there are two main perspectives which look at happiness. On the one hand, there are people who say happiness, to track happiness, you need to say, how are you feeling at this time? So the best way to track happiness is to constantly have something going, what are you feeling now? And then maybe another couple of hours, what are you feeling now? Experience sampling, so that it's at that kind of level of affect what you're feeling. And if you have more of those times that you're beeped that you say, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good, then you say, mind you, of course, after you've been beeped a few times, you might very much be feeling not so good about it. But that sense that it's about positive feelings and emotions. It's something that is of the moment. That's one approach to happiness. The other approach to happiness is to say, it's not just about of the moment, but happiness is about a fulfilled life. So it's about, something may make you feel good at the time, but it may not be good for you in the long term. So there are those two kind of traditions of people, particularly psychologists, who talk about happiness. There may be overlap between them, but there are those two broad differences in the way happiness is understood. Quality of life, again, quality of life research has been going on for many, many years. It tends to be objective, so it tends to be looking at those broader range of indicators, often at a national level, that say how countries and nations are doing, but there may also be subjective measures within quality of life. So it's that same broad well-being agenda, looking beyond the economic to say, how are societies and nations, and sometimes communities, doing? Well-being, I think, straddles the two. So it straddles that sort of psychological, subjective, how people feeling approach with the more objective, how people are doing, or at least that's how we have understood it. And the last point there is something that is fundamental to our own research, is that yes, you need to have the quantitative measures, but you also need to have the qualitative to be sure that you understand them and how people are making sense. You need to have both subjective and objective, rather than think you can just take the subjective and float free with it, away from how people are doing in objective terms, or that everything can be captured through the object and you don't actually need to discuss with people how they themselves are feeling or seeing their lives. So we are very much a kind of both and project, saying both quantitative and qualitative, both subjective and objective, and recognising that those things may not marry up. So the subjective and the objective may actually give you quite conflicting information, the qualitative and the quantitative similarly. And that in a sense that's part of the fun of it, to look at the difference between the different approaches. So with our project, as Stefan has said, I come from a background in development studies and sociology of development. And coming then to the well-being literature, what strikes you is that most of the approaches are quite northern dominated. Of course, that's not something that's new in development, but it is evident in this area. So our concern was to think, okay, what might an approach to well-being look like if you start from the experience in the South? Now, as ever, it's a bit of a mix of the two. So it's coming from our own, the different people within the team, background in research, reading in development, reading obviously of the wellbeing literature also, and then quite an extensive period of grounding and piloting together. So to get a sense that is nearer to the way people in the South talk and feel and act, recognising that the approach that we're using, particularly the quantitative part of it, is necessarily somewhat alien. But we try to make it not too alienating. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was to say, okay, let's look at poverty and let's look at well-being. Let's, within particular community contexts, say, does it make sense actually to look at well-being? What do we learn additionally from looking at well-being and asking a range of questions, including subjective questions about how people are thinking about their lives, compared to just looking at how they're doing in economic terms? So that's what the kind of core idea of the project was about. So I've already said we've got 2 rounds of research in the same communities in Zambia and India, 3 to 4 months in each country, and in each place we've got around 350 respondents. Because we recognise that relationships are very important to well-being, we figured that into the research design. So we have got husbands and wives who are interviewed separately, are 300 of the respondents, so 150 couples, and then 50 women who are heading households. That's our aim anyway. And that because within international development it's widely recognised that women heading households are often more disadvantaged than women who are in marriage partnerships. So our approach, our definition of well-being such as it is, and you can see it's a somewhat circular approach, is well-being is experience when people have what they need for life to be good. So why did we come up with that? We wanted to have it go beyond the individual, so it's when people rather than when an individual. We wanted to recognise that well-being is something that is experienced. So although we say that we're researching well-being, all that we can track is, in a sense, indicators of well-being. But well-being itself is something that I think is beyond measurement and beyond capture. It's something that people experience or they don't. And then when people have what they need for life to be good, so to be good, obviously that evaluative part of well-being, but when people have what they need, so recognising that well-being is about resources. It is about, and those resources may be material resources, they may be social resources, they may be cultural or psychological resources, but trying to ground it also. So that's what's behind that particular definition. And we have particularly been influenced by a previous research project which was in Sri Lanka, which was called the PADHI Research Project, which means psychosocial approaches to development and humanitarian intervention. And I've given you there a little diagram which I produced on the basis of PADHI's approach, which says, okay, there are three key things that we need to look at. On the far side, well-being. What constitutes well-being? What's our understanding of what well-being is? Then, as a kind of interference coming between the big arrow and the star, what's mediating well-being? So what is there within society, or it might be within psychology, or different kinds of issues that actually makes a difference to who can achieve well-being and who cannot? And then the large arrow is recognising that well-being is not just about what's happening within an individual, but that there are systems, there are institutions, there's a whole environment that makes a great deal of difference to whether people can achieve well-being or not. So our research then is trying to answer those three questions. What constitutes well-being, what enables well-being, what mediates well-being. I'm going to pause at this point and say, is this okay, the level that I'm going at? Am I going too fast, too slow? Is there anything anyone wants to ask?
I just wanted to ask, or maybe you come to that, but I just wondered, how did you choose the particular areas where you carried out the research?
As with most of my life, it's happen chance. We had a previous research project which was an initiative from Oxfam Hong Kong, who came to us and wanted to work with us, and they chose the original areas that we worked in, and we then just worked on from that. So the first one, what constitutes well-being? What we've come to is a model of 7 domains of well-being, and this is generated through a mixture of approaches. As I said, reading, thinking. We started from the PADHI approach, which had 5 dimensions, and then we added a couple to it, and also piloting in the field and seeing what made sense to people and the way that they were talking and thinking, and also what hung together statistically and what didn't. So the domains have slightly changed over the time of the project, but this is where we have come to now. So 7 domains, which you'll see, those of you who are familiar with international development, draw a lot on the international development background. So it's a psychosocial approach rather than a psychological approach. So looking at agency and participation, looking at social connections, bringing in close relationships, which is not so much recognised within international development, but clearly is important in terms of broader well-being, work, physical and mental health, understandings of self-worth. And then we also added in something about values and meaning, which has been a difficult domain to capture, but is clearly very important in terms of where people are, the way that they talk about well-being. So this might be in terms of religion, it might be in other ways, in terms of kind of feeling right about where they are in life. I won't talk more about it, but it's one of those things that's very easy to see it's important, it's very difficult actually to get a handle on and test quantitatively. I won't talk very much about our methods, but just to give you a sense, this is one of our researchers, Jonathan, with one of our respondents, Maggie. And you can see just here that there's a set of images we use to enable people to choose responses. So when we come to the well-being, the inner well-being part of our survey, which is the central part, We ask people questions and give them a range of responses so that we can produce a quantitative output. And in order to explain the range of responses, we are using a little scale which starts from 2 blacks as feeling negative about your well-being to 2 whites at the other end feeling positive about well-being. So the darkness and light kind of imagery seemed to work well in Zambia, and we've taken it to India. It seemed to work well there too. We try to be as conversational as we can. So although we're doing a survey, the majority of the research team are qualitative rather than quantitative in their instincts. So we try not to give people a battery of questions which we require them to respond to, but rather to talk them through. And we've thought quite a lot about that in terms of the design of the survey, what we ask when, how we ask questions, and so on. We also have qualitative interviews following up particular issues, and we have some group meetings in which we check back with people the understandings that we're coming to. There's been a lot of learning on the way, and the major part of that that's important in terms of understanding this presentation is that the statistical analysis that we did on the Zambian round 1 survey, the model that we had, this model of well-being, the 7 domains and that, it didn't hang together, it didn't work statistically. So that means that I can't talk about domains of well-being for the Zambia data. I can talk about particular items and the way people responded to them, but not about the domains. We then went back, thought about our longitudinal design and the difficulties of having a rather different survey in round 1 from round 2, decided that we needed to try and get it right if we could. So in India we went in with a slightly different survey, particularly the inner well-being items were asked in a different way, as well as many items were changed. And in that case it did work statistically. So we can talk about domains for the India round 1, and hopefully after round 2 in Zambia, where we built on the learning from India, we'll be able to talk about the domains there too. But at the moment, I can't do that. So I'm talking about domains for India, but about items on well-being in terms of the Zambia research. So the sites, obviously Zambia and India are tremendously different from one another, tremendously different in particular in the way that they are positioned at present in terms of kind of international development, ways of looking at the world. So India is, the next global leader vying with China for that position, and Zambia is very much fallen behind and coming up quite low on a lot of development indicators. And you can see the difference in the 2 areas as well. Chiawa, the area in Zambia, is much more challenging in terms of its environmental properties, so a harder place to farm than Saguja, but both places are quite difficult, and further inland from where we are there in Chiawa, the land is more fertile and things are a bit less sandy and hard agriculturally than they are present. You can see that for Chiawa it's actually quite close to Lusaka. It's only 2.5 hours drive away, but despite that it's quite remote because there's no continuous road. You have to cross on a ferry and no bridge across the river as yet, although one is soon to be built. We're here. So it's a game management area on the edge of a national park, and an area which has a lot of challenges in terms of agriculture. Saguja, Chhattisgarh is a hilly, again seen as a remote area, it's a hilly area, an Adivasi area, so ethnic minority group, hilly and forest location. So although the 2 places are very different in terms of the national context, there are quite a lot of similarities between the 2 areas in terms of the specificities of them. For both, environment is a major issue. So in Chiawa, in the Zambia context, because it's on the edge of it's a game management area on the edge of a national park, there are lots of issues about conflict between people and wildlife. People are not allowed to damage animals, but animals are able to damage people's crops and so on. So there's a lot of problems, both personal safety problems, but also livelihood security problems to do with wildlife for Zambia. In the Indian context, as I said, it's a forested area, an area where people have had, these people have traditionally had rights to the forest. They still do have rights that have been recognised by the Indian state, but the question is whether they can actually achieve those rights in practice. So there are lots of issues about land, issues about titling, issues about overall livelihood security related to the environment in both places. Religion is also a big issue in both places. There's some politics around religion, particularly in the Chhattisgarh context, with Hindu nationalists seeking to, as they say, reconvert Adivasi people, some of whom have become Christian or who are following their own Adivasi religion. But also in terms of personal change. There's a lot of change going on around religion in both places, particularly when people talk about health, people moving between churches because they're able to get better kinds of support or feel that they are more effective. And the same thing in India. So religion is very important in terms of the ways people are understanding well-being, the way they talk about well-being, the way that they seek to achieve it. Alcohol is a major issue and a major problem in both areas, and associated with domestic violence and other kinds of bad things. Both areas people have few savings and assets, even recognising that people may not be very willing to admit to these when asked about them in a survey. There's also limited access to credit, with high reliance for credit on family and friends in Zambia and on moneylenders in India. Commonalities and differences in gender. So gender equalities are very obvious in both contexts, although the form that they take differs between the two contexts. In both contexts, it's mainly nuclear households with limited education, particularly of respondents. And here we see a big difference between the generations. So children now are much more likely to be going to school. The respondents who we're talking to from their 20s to their 70s have had much less education in India than in Zambia. In both contexts, you see, for the children also, that as you go up to secondary level, it's mainly the boys who are still at school, whereas at primary level, the girls are well represented. A huge difference, and one that affected our research, is that in Zambia there are many women who are living without men in the household. In India, in this area, it's very uncommon. It's very difficult to live as a woman alone in India. There are all sorts of problems that people face in terms of being accused of witchcraft and so on. So we were actually unable to find our 50 single women in the India sample. We were only able to find 26, whereas in Zambia we got more than 70 without any difficulty. So that tells you something about the gender division of labour and the forms that gender inequalities take. Another big difference was in terms of children. So in Zambia there's a lot of circulation of children living with people who are not their own parents, whether they're nieces and nephews or whether they're living with grandparents, particularly grandmothers. So usually kin, but not necessarily their own parents. Whereas in India, there were also a number of children who were living away from home, but they tended to be living in institutional contexts, so boarding schools or living separately in order to go to school. Something that was very striking in Sarguja, not what we expected at all, is that there's an adverse sex ratio amongst children. So when we asked about children in the household, we found that there were many more sons than daughters. That was true in both cases, and it's understandable because daughters marry away earlier, so younger, so they'll leave the household at a younger age. But when we asked about children that they had, all children that they'd had, including children who've grown up and moved away now, there was still a marked sex ratio difference in Sarguja. Only 92 daughters per 100 sons. And this is in a state, Chhattisgarh, which has got the best sex ratio in India. So it's a very shocking finding and something which needs to be followed up. Big differences in terms of employment. So the main form of employment in Chiawa, because of it being a game management area on the edge of the national park, is safari lodges. 25% of the men had jobs there, only 1% of women. In Sarguja, the employment pattern was more equal by gender, but you still have the problem of women being much more likely to be at the lower levels, men at the higher levels. What's interesting in the Indian context is to compare gender indicators in the sort of social community context with formal employment and formal politics where the state is involved. And what we find quite interestingly is that in the social community, the traditional, if you like, context, men are very predominant. But when you get to formal employment, these are government jobs, and the political sphere, women are much better represented. So in gender terms, it does seem that, at least for this place, the state is doing something to even up the imbalance that is still there within the social and community context. What's interesting in the Chiawa context is that for Zambia, the social and community context is relatively good for women, in that the person who's kind of in charge of the whole of Chiawa is the chieftainess, who's clearly a woman, and there are also women village heads, which in other parts of Zambia there are not. But still, that hasn't crossed over in terms of the employment situation. The big difference between the two contexts is in terms of hunger and the state. So in Chiawa, 44% of our respondents said that they at some point had to go hungry during the previous year. And there again, gender and marital status is a big discriminator. So it's particularly single women, married men the least, single women the most. In Sarguja in India, 95% said they had had no hunger. And this was something that people volunteered. So when you went and talked to them about well-being, they said the main difference is we are now getting subsidised rice, highly subsidised ration rice, which means that we're not going hungry anymore. And this was a huge change because this is a food deficit area where people have really struggled in the past. And you can see the visibility of the state in at least that part of India, in the level at which the price that you have to pay for ration rice, it is different depending on certain sort of criteria that they have, is inscribed on the houses. So as you go through the houses in the village, you can see written on the house exactly what level they have been assessed at, and therefore what price of rice they have to pay. So there's a real visibility of the state in that part, which is just not there in the Zambian context. And that has had a lot of knock-on effects in terms of people feeling that things are changing, feeling that there's a positive direction of change. Difficult to put numbers to it, but it was clear in the way people talked. You also had very good roads in that area, and there are complex of reasons for that, which I won't go into, but I can talk about later. Also welfare and employment programs that are provided by the state, so they're enabling people to have certain subsidies, particularly in terms of child nutrition, and also to have employment during the off times of the year, so that when agriculture is not possible, it's a rain-dependent area, so one harvest a year, one main harvest a year, people are able to get employment building rural roads, for example, which helps to see them through the hunger times. By comparison, in Chiawa, very limited provision of state services and very low expectations also. So in the subjective questions that we asked about people's confidence in being able to change things, people's expectations from the state, those were some of the lowest responses of any of the subjective responses that we got in Chiawa. Not only was there not much provision, but people didn't even expect there to be. So a big difference in terms of both the levels of provision, but also people's expectations. People in India moan about the state constantly, but they're really lucky to have a state to moan about. As I said, there's a lot of change between the two surveys, so we can't do direct comparisons between Zambia and India, except on a few items. So these items that I picked out here there are 11 of the inner well-being items coming from this end that were common to the two countries, and then the last two ask people to reflect. How do you think that you're doing? How do you feel that you're doing over the past 12 months? And how are you doing now compared with 5 years ago? So they're not inner well-being items, they're asking people to reflect subjectively on their objective economic status. So you can see that there are several items where there's very little difference between the countries. So particularly these two health items, very similar. But you can see that there are other items where there is a lot of difference. Confidence that you could change official decisions. Neither case was it high. So 3 is the midpoint, in neither case is it high, but look how low it is for Zambia. So considerably more confidence in India that you could at least have a go at changing things. On the other hand, in terms of self-worth, how people assess their personal achievements, how they said they felt about the way that they faced difficulties in their lives, people in Zambia were very positive. So this is one of those things where it's difficult to take it necessarily at face value. There clearly was a problem in the area where we were in India of people claiming things for themselves. So you'd ask, well, how do you feel about how you felt difficulties? They'd say, no, it's not for me to say, you just ask my neighbour about how I'm doing. So there are also cultures in the way people respond to these kinds of questions that are very important in terms of the ways that they score themselves. So we need to be careful before we extrapolate and say, yes, everyone in Zambia feels great about their self-worth, people in India feel really bad about themselves. It may not be that at all, but it may be about cultures of expression and what people are ready to say, given different kinds of prompts that you present them with. People in Zambia, again, were positive about their capacity to bring change working with others. So, in general, about themselves and their agency, there were more positive responses. On the other hand, one of the most extreme differences between the two was on this one, which is again about social connections. So what we're interested in, on the whole, in wellbeing studies and in other studies, social connections are seen to be a good thing. Social capital, it's seen as positive. It may be used for bad ends, like the mafia, but in general it's seen as a good thing to have it. But what we've realised is that there's another side of social connections which can also be negative. So in the case of Zambia, there is a lot of fear of witchcraft. There's a lot of sense of envy and of anxiety about other people, what other people are doing or wanting to do to you. Not being able to assume that people are on your side. And that's what that item is picking up. Whereas in India, not to say that everyone thinks that everyone else is great, but there's not that same sense of anxiety of people being out to get you. And if there is a sense of that, it's very much more that people are out to get you, rather than in Zambia this mix of personal animosity and a kind of metaphysical sense of witchcraft being done to you. So quite a lot of difference in cultural terms there, and something that is very, very present. However you make sense of it, it's very present in terms of the ways that people talk about their lives and the kinds of opportunities and possibilities and things that hold them back in the context where we were in Zambia. So what makes a difference to subjective assessments? We made up a composite of economic status drawn from a mix of indicators that we use, so education, occupation, assets, various things. For these subjective assessments of their lives, we didn't ask how happy people were in Zambia, we did in India. Economic status significantly predicted both of them and the happiness one. Gender marital status didn't predict how people felt they were doing over the previous year, but they did predict how they compared how they're doing now with how they had been doing 5 years ago. And in Zambia you can see both of the economic subjective reflections were predicted both by economic status and by gender marital status. Now, economic status and gender marital status are also linked to each other, but even when you put the two, so there's some overlap there, but even when you put the two in together, both of them are having independent effects. So those structural differences, those good old-fashioned sociological differences, are still significant, even when you're talking about subjective assessments. But okay, those are subjective assessments of their objective status. What about when we get to the really more subjective assessments about how people are feeling about what they can do and be in their own lives? So I said at the beginning we could talk about domain level only for India. Knock down, drag out economic status affected all of the domains. Gender marital status, 4 out of the 7. Looking at item level in Zambia, there was more of a balance between economic status and gender marital status in terms of what was affecting, what was predicting people's item scores, looking at them across the domains. So there was more of a balance, gender marital status was stronger, economic status a little bit less strong, but both of them significant predictors of how people are thinking and feeling about what they can do and be in their lives. So, conclusions. What enables well-being? Our first question. As I've said, they're poor and marginalised communities with obviously very major differences between them, but also some similarities. The most significant difference in terms of well-being, the way people talk about it, is in terms of this elimination of hunger, fundamental, basic need. So querying those kinds of approaches like Maslow's approach, which says you need to satisfy your basic needs before you worry about others. In fact, what we find is that people who are still hungry are still worried about their supposedly higher order needs, but the elimination of hunger in the India context was tremendously important. That in turn is linked to a different understanding of the relationship between people and the powers that be. So in the Indian context, for all the problems of the Indian state, you have got a situation where you've got citizens and state, bureaucratic relationships, political relationships, problematic in many ways, but still there. In the Zambian context, you have got, obviously you've got a formal democracy, but in terms of people's experience of power, it's a different kind of power. It's the power of the chieftainess and the subject. It's very different. There's a different feel to it. What I haven't talked about, but which is tremendously important to bear in mind in the Indian context, is there's not just the state above, but there is a very politically mobilised population below who are pressing for their rights. So there's a kind of virtuous confluence between a state that makes promises and organisations working with people to ensure that they claim their promises. So it's come both from the top down, but importantly from the bottom up, to hold the state accountable, make sure people get what they promised. But in terms of those broader questions about the politics of well-being, it's clear that you can't just look at well-being at an individual level. You must look at the enabling environment and take seriously the policy and political context which enables people to achieve well-being. What constitutes well-being? I'm not the stats person on the team. I haven't presented the factor analysis, so you'll have to take it on trust that it worked, but I'm told that it does work. in terms of the India sample, both at a single index level and at the 7 domain level. But with a single index, you're really not learning anything. So if we keep the 7 wellbeing domains to be able to see different aspects of people's lives and how they are doing in them. What mediates well-being? Obviously, we looked at other kinds of mediators of well-being. I've only talked today about economic status and gender marital status. Both of those structural differences amongst people making a tremendous difference, both to the way they reflect on their objective status, but also to the ways that they talk about what they themselves feel that they can do and be their inner well-being. Economic status, the most important, which is of course consistent with other studies of subjective well-being and economic status. To us, what it says is it's really important to keep both the objective and the subjective together. So to reinforce that commitment that we started with, which says don't let go of the objective, don't think that you can tell everything with the subjective, just as looking at the subjective is important to complement your objective data. And keep awareness of the structural differences between people rather than thinking that you can explain everything at the individual or psychological level. To finish on a more modest note, as I said, so this is its initial analysis. We're still in the middle of the project, so hopefully these findings are robust, but we will see, and we'll see particularly over time what differences we can discern between round 1 and then round 2, 2 years later, how people's situations have changed in terms of their poverty status, how they've changed in terms of the way they talk about their well-being. In our research, we have attempted to be sensitive to the local context, and we're more sensitive than it appears from this that we are. But we have to recognise that this kind of approach, these kind of quantitative approaches, when it comes down to it, they are ways in which we discipline populations. They are not the vernacular. They're not the vernacular that we speak here, they're not the vernacular that we speak anywhere. So in order really to understand how people themselves talk about well-being, what it means for them, how they put together the different aspects of their lives, this is not the way to do it. Or if you do it like this, you'd have to have a much longer bottom-up process in order to discern that. So it's artificial, asking people particular questions, asking them to choose particular responses. It's not natural, it's not the way people talk. But what we've tried to do is at least to go about it in a way that is less offensive to the way people themselves would talk about their lives. So for an example, one of the ways in which the Adivasi people in Saguja talk about well-being is in terms of the environment being a garden, and in garden which it's their responsibility to tend. If they tend the garden well, then God will give rain on the garden. If they fall down in terms of their responsibilities for looking after the garden, then the rain will not come. So there's very much a sense of an environmental holism, a kind of ecology there, which obviously is a great challenge to the kind of approach that I have presented here. And then thanks to all the other people whose work is actually fundamental to what I've been talking about. So our UK-based team, and then the teams in Zambia and in India who have gathered research, of course our funders, without whom none of this would be possible. Thank you.